may not know, they played a game in the World Blitz and Rapid Chess Championship, which went e4, e6, d4, d5. It was a very back and forth game. Richard was winning at multiple points in that game. Magnus, however, did end up winning that game, which was really critical for him winning the World Blitz Championship ahead of a certain streamer, Hikaru Nakamura, who is doing this recap. Anyway, you guys, back to the game. So we get e4, e5, knight f3, knight to f6. Richard playing the solid Petrov defense. We get knight takes e5, d6, knight to d3, knight takes e4, queen e2, queen e7, knight f4, and now we get c6. In the fateful 6th game of the World Chess Championship match held all the way back in 2018 between Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana, Fabiano played this move knight c6. We had knight d5, knight to d4, knight takes e7, knight takes e2, knight d5, knight d4, knight to a3, knight e6, f3, knight c5, d4, knight d7, and c3. And the reason I say fateful is because in that 6th game, they played a very long game. Magnus tried very hard to win this queenless middle game. He was actually losing at one point. I believe Sessa said there was a forced mate in, I think it was 36 if I remember correctly. At any rate, Fabiano did not find it. The game ended in a draw, and we know how the rest of the match and of course history would turn out. So in this game, after knight to f4, we get c6 being played here by Richard to stop knight to d5. We get f3, knight to f6, d4, bishop to f5, c4, and now we get this interesting move h5. Now the reason Richard played h5 is very straightforward. First of all, the queens are opposing each other, so it's very likely there will be a queen trade. Secondly, if queens come off the board, let's say black plays a move like, I don't know, queen takes e2, bishop takes e2, and let's just say bishop e7, white can eventually go g4, taking a lot of space on the king side here. You have more space in the center as well, so it'd be a little bit unpleasant to play. So after c4, we get h5, knight to c3, knight to a6, and now Magnus plays this move king to f2. Now, one thing that's very difficult here about this position is that black doesn't really know whether to trade the queens here or not trade them. For example, you can obviously castle, you can also play knight to b4. What do you want to do? In retrospect, I really think that Richard probably should have traded the queens, and the reason that I say that is from a purely psychological standpoint. When you play an opening like the Petrov defense, there's one goal in mind. Be very solid unless your opponent with the white pieces takes a lot of chances and tries to complicate the situation and make things really unclear. So normally, if you're playing a solid opening like this, what you're thinking is like, if my opponent takes big chances, then yes, I want to play for more, but otherwise you want to stay solid. And to me, I feel like Richard sort of lost the thread, or on the other hand, Magnus knew that Richard was going to want something that was more dynamic and complicated, which is why he played this opening. At any rate, after king to f2, I really do feel like Richard, based on the opening choice, should have stayed solid, traded the queens, and played something like knight to b4 here. And after a move like bishop to d1, yes, white is probably a little bit better because you can go rook to e1, maybe a3, and so forth, but black should be okay. So as I said, when you play an opening that's really solid as black, normally you want to keep the mindset the same versus suddenly switching in the middle of the game, or at least right here around move 11 or move number 12. Richard, however, is a player who likes to be very aggressive as well, so he plays knight to b4, and now Magnus plays this move queen to d1. Now, there's nothing wrong with Magnus playing queen to d1, even though he has the king on f2 here. He has his pawn on f3, which covers these critical e4 and g4 squares for the knight, and overall, white can develop very easily. You can play like a3, bishop e2, maybe bishop d3, and even rook e1, depending on what black follows up with, but at any rate, it's not as bad as it looks for white, even though the king has moved to f2. Richard, however, here starts to lose the thread almost immediately. He decides to castle. Magnus plays this move knight to d3, which is a good move, offering the traded pieces, because if black trades all the pieces off here, say on d3, white can go rook e1, there's bishop g5, you can even go like rook b1, b4, and b5 and attack on the queen side, so it's very, very hard to play for black, and already white has a big advantage. So after knight to d3 is played, Richard plays this move d5, Magnus goes c5. He, of course, does not want to trade on d5, so if you trade on d5, the pawn on d4 is weak. There are ideas like queen to h4, and overall it feels pretty hard to play, and the computer, of course, really doesn't like white's position with this underdevelopment of the bishop on f1 and the rook on h1 as well. So Magnus goes c5, closing up the center of the board. Also, now there is a long-term idea that after, let's just say black trades everything off on d3 again, you can play for b4, b5 with a4, rook b1, and it's a very fast attack, and your king on f2 here is very safe because the knight cannot jump to either e4 or g4. So we get this position where c5 is played, and here Richard plays this move, knight takes d3. Now, the concept is very clear-cut behind what he does, and it's very concrete, but it simply is not correct. What Richard should have done here is he should have played a slightly counterintuitive trade first with bishop takes d3, and now played this very stunning move, knight to e4. If he had played it like this, the position gets really, really complex. It's not clear who's better here, because if white takes the knight with the pawn, black goes queen f6 check, attacking the king and the pawn on d4, and white's supposed to go king e2, but after queen takes d4, white probably has nothing better to do here than to go bishop b1, queen c4, bishop d3, and queen d4 and make a repetition. If you go bishop e3 here, after queen to e5, there are a lot of problems with your position. First of all, black has d4, forking the knight and the bishop. Secondly, there's an idea with d takes e4, and then you'll lose the bishop on d3 or the queen on d1. And third, your king is just stuck in the middle of the board here. So white would be in a lot of trouble here. The computer actually says the best move is a3, but after knight takes d3, queen takes d3, d4, if you try rook a d1, black cannot capture either the knight or the bishop, because queen takes rook would be checkmate, but black can very simply go bishop takes c5, and now the rooks are connected. Black will win the bishop on e3 or the knight on c3, and black is already up by one pawn, and the white king is stuck in the middle of the board, so this would be GG. So this idea of bishop takes d3 would have been correct, but again, without computer analysis, without knowing exactly what's going on, Richard plays the more human approach. He decides to trade the knights and then go knight e4. As I said before, if black were to trade the bishops here, after queen takes d3, you have no development here. The bishop on f8 and the rook on h8 are not in the game. The pawn on f3 stops the knight jumps, and white has a free hand to simply start pushing p on the queen side with b4, b5, and rook b1, and this is disastrous. Computer already says this is almost +2 for white, so black would just simply be lost. So Richard plays knight e4, sort of understanding the danger that's looming in the position if he trades off all the minor pieces. So he plays knight to e4, but now after pawn takes, and bishop to e2, on first glance after this move, queen to f6, it looks like black is doing very well. But of course, as we know from computers, there are moves that are slightly better. Now, what should have been played here was queen to h4 check first, and the reason is not very obvious. But after g3, queen to f6 here, the point is that now if white plays a move like bishop to e3, for example, black can go bishop takes c5, and if you play rook f1, which is what happened in the game, now black can play this move. I believe black can just trade, and after rook takes d4, let's say you go queen b3, there's this move bishop to e6 check, and if you play a move like queen to c1, there is now also bishop to h3, winning the rook on f1, because the check, of course, would be the classic fossil. So queen to h4 would have been the best move if it had been played, but instead Richard plays queen to f6, and the reason becomes very apparent immediately, because after bishop to e3, bishop takes c5, rook f1 here, now if you trade on d4, after bishop takes d4, rook takes d4, queen to c1, you don't have this bishop h3 check. My king will just retreat to g1. I will manually castle the king by hand, and with this extra knight and ideas like knight to b5 even, for example, white should be in very good shape here. Also because your pawns are a little bit loose here, like even if you go bishop e6, king g1, queen to e5, on first glance it looks good, but after queen to e3, now you go f5 to support the pawn at e4, but I can play a move like h4 to fix the dark squares where you can't push the pawns forward. I can also play a move like rook to d1 and try to attack towards the pawn on a7, and overall it's just very, very bad for black in the long term. So that is why Richard should have thrown in the tickle check with queen h4 first to provoke the pawn push. Alas, if he had done that, it's very hard to know what would have happened. I still think Magnus would have had good chance to win, but he would have had to have been very, very precise. At any rate, we got this position after rook to f1, and now Richard does not take on d4 here. He plays this move queen h4. Now my thought process behind all this is pretty straightforward. I think that during the game, Richard probably thought that around this point he was in a lot of trouble and he had to play knight e4. But then once he got to this position around rook f1, he realized that if he plays simple chess with bishop takes d4, bishop takes rook takes queen c1 and king g1, he's probably going to lose a long, slow game with limited hope, and it's just going to be very unpleasant to have to suffer for a few hours, which is why I think at this point he decided, you know what, to heck with it, as they say. I'm just going to go all in, I'm going to sack more pieces, try to pretend that I'm Paul Morphy or Michael Tal, and just go for it. So he plays queen h4 here. Magnus plays king to g1, of course, which is the correct move, and now we get this move bishop to d6. Of course, now black has two bishops that are en prise. You could play a move like bishop e6, for example, here, but now the computer gives a couple options. One that I would probably go for is simply queen to c1, because now if black trades on d4, again, you can take, and then after rook takes d4, you have knight to b5, forking the rook on d4 and the pawn on a7. Black cannot capture the knight on b5 due to the pin, and this will be winning. And additionally, if you play let's say bishop e6, queen c1. If you go bishop d6 now, I can simply go bishop to f4. If you trade, I take with the rook, attacking the queen, and then I will capture the pawn on e4 next move. And if you play a move like f5, just to illustrate, once again, you have a lot of problems. I can even just go d5 right here, because after bishop takes, rook takes, I attack the queen. And if you take with the pawn, now I go knight b5, winning the bishop on d6. So all in all, it's really, really bad at this point. But as I said, I think that when Richard went queen h4, he was a little bit on tilt, a little bit unhappy, but he also realized that realistically, he was already in trouble and he didn't want to try to defend a worse position, which he would probably lose, so he goes for it. So after king g1, we get bishop to d6 here. Rook takes f5 is played. Richard captures on h2. We got queen takes h2 and king f1. Queen to h1 is played, and now we get bishop to g1 played by Magnus. Now at this point, white has 2 extra pieces. You have an extra bishop on e2, extra knight on c3. Your king, however, is a little bit weak, but if you get even like 2 quick moves like queen d2, queen to e3, for example, say I just play this position, I get the queen to e3, the queen will guard the bishop, I bring the rook in, even move the bishop and go knight e2 to guard the bishop, and within a couple of moves, it'll all be over. So Richard plays g6, trying to continue to do something here. Of course, bishop to h2 would not work, because now I can very simply go king to f2. You could play g6 transposing back into the game, but without a move like g6, now if you trade, of course, the 2 extra pieces will play in the long term. And if you don't take, let's say you go back, for example, it doesn't really do anything. White can just play like queen b3, maybe queen a4 as well. Multiple options here, but all roads lead to Rome. So after bishop to g1, we get g6 here. Magnus takes a pawn, and now Richard goes rook f8. So now in addition to having the threat of bishop to h2, there's also an open f-file as well. So on first glance, it looks like this might be dangerous, but Magnus actually is moving very quickly at this point, and he shows that he really is confident and knows that Richard's whole idea of attacking is complete balagna. So after rook f8, we get bishop to c4 here, not queen to b3, by the way, because then black could trade the rooks and go rook to f8, winning the queen on f7. So we get bishop to c4, bishop to h2 is played here. Of course, you could trade the rooks and try to go rook f8 here, but after rook f8, white simply goes queen b3, guarding the bishop. And next move, I have queen e6 check. I can also take the knight. I can maybe even just bring the rook to the center of the board, and black is just running out of pieces. If black had an extra rook or an extra knight or a bishop or something to try to put more pressure on the bishop, there might be some hope, but you have a lone rook going after the bishop, and black simply has a queen and a bishop, so it's just not enough material. So Richard plays bishop h2, we get king to f2, we get rook takes rook, bishop takes, rook f8, queen to b3, of course, guarding the bishop, and now the rook on a1 also guards the bishop on g1. We get bishop takes bishop, rook takes bishop, and at this point the game is basically over, but Richard keeps playing on just sort of out of inertia. You don't really want to resign at this point, so you kind of play, you throw in some checks and you hope for a miracle, but of course against a player of Magnus' caliber, even though he's playing badly and is not having a great tournament, it's all hopeless. So we get queen to h4 check, king to e2, queen to g4, king to d2 here. Now the computer of course says you can be stone cold and play king to e3, queen check, and you can even just gobble the pawn with the king in the center of the board because there are no checks like rook e8, queen guards the bishop, and this would be winning. But of course, at this point in the game, you don't want to take any unnecessary risks. You know, you might overlook a move and lose the game, so you can just simply zigzag with the king here. And now, even though black is going to win the bishop, you still have an extra pony, which means that you're going to win. So you get rook takes bishop, knight to e2 here, queen to f5, queen to h3. A great move by Magnus. Of course, you could play a move like queen to f6 to keep the queens on the board, but even here, after a move like queen to e3, white will eventually go like king c1, rook e1, knight c3, knight takes e4, and just win the game. Black at the moment has 2 pawns for the pony, but at the end of the day, you will definitely lose the e4 pawn, and so this is just basic technique, and anybody over, say, 2500 would win this, even against Magnus if they had the extra knight. So we get queen to f5. Magnus correctly plays queen h3, trading the queens, of course. Now, if these pawns were more connected, like say, for example, you could magically put the c pawn on the d file, there might be some hope, but here, because of the weaknesses of the pawns, there's just nothing you can do. And additionally, to add insult to injury, now the rook on g1 is also perfectly placed so that if black trades the queens, there will be a weakness on g6. Here, Richard trades the queens. Again, it's all hopeless. If you go like king c7, I can simply trade. You connect the pawns temporarily, but after knight to f4, blockading these 2 pawns, let's just say h4, rook h1, rook h7, and g3, it's all hopeless. You'll lose this pawn on h4, and the knight blockades the pawns, and there's nothing you can do. You can't even go rook g7 because there's knight e6 forking the king and the rook. So after queen to h3, Richard trades. He goes rook to f3, hoping for rook takes pawn, also losing, but Magnus, of course, slams the door by playing this move rook to g3 here. Knight guards the rook. If you trade the rooks, obviously, again, you're going to lose the e-pawn, and the rest will be very basic. If you don't trade the rooks and you go like rook to f6, for example, there are many ways white can win here, but the simplest would be to go king d2, followed by king to e3, capturing the pawn at e4, or for example, even something like here, you don't even have to take, you can even go knight to f4, and you'll win either the pawn on g6 or h5, and it's just simply hopeless. So after rook g3, Richard resigns this game. Magnus gets a very, very critical win